kids here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Today we're going to be talking about legacy media lapdogs, or actually the very different way that legacy media handles various stories versus how citizen journalism is beginning to move in and fill some of those gaps. And we're going to start with I just have to say this is a very tragic story on many levels, but it's also a very solid illustration of how the legacy media has shifted in its role from being watchdogs, who worked basically for the public and for the citizens in making sure that they were well informed, into being lapdogs for the people who are in power. And we start with a story out of Kellogg, Idaho. Maybe you've heard about this over the weekend. The Idaho Tribune actually broke the story, saying there's a lot we still don't know about what happened in Kellogg yesterday night. This was on Father's Day, but here's what we know so far. And I'm gonna give you the thumbnail sketch. I hope that in no way this sounds like, I'm trying to say like this is a good thing. It's tragic on many levels. But the thumbnail sketches, there was an 18-year-old graduate from Kellogg High School. This, by the way, this is the high school that was recently in the news for punishing a kid for saying girls are girls, boys are boys. There is no in between. Nonetheless, there was an 18-year-old senior who graduated this year from Kellogg High School. Apparently, this kid had some history. And by history, I mean inappropriately taking pictures of girls to the point that the girls at the school, if they had any skin showing whatsoever, this kid would have his phone out and be taking pictures of it. Or the girls would tell each other, hey, he's taking pictures. You might want to put on a sweatshirt or something. Now, it goes far beyond that. This kid also was apparently caught masturbating in class. He had inappropriate material, by which I mean child porn, on his school-issued Chromebook. It was an issue, and it was brought to the attention of school authorities. Perhaps I don't know for sure if it was brought to the attention of law enforcement, but it was a known problem, and apparently that was a problem that spilled over to the boy's relationship, the young man's relationship with his next door neighbors. The neighbors had noticed that when their daughters would go out and jump on the trampoline, this guy was always out there watching. And it set off the instincts in the mom of these young girls saying, well, I don't know if I like that. That seems like a really strange thing to do. Well, apparently this last weekend, the girls came inside and looked pretty shocked. And the parents were like, well, what's wrong? And the girls told their parents this young man was standing in front of a window, pleasuring himself in full view of everybody. And I don't know exactly what ensued after that, but at some point, the girl's father snapped. He went to the next door neighbors. He broke the door down, or broke in, and shot to death this young man, as well as 3 other members of this young man's family, I believe including a minor sibling. Okay, nobody is trying to say that was a good thing. Justice was served. But what's very interesting, the reason I bring this up is this is not about, if the law would have taken care of it, he wouldn't have had to. That's not my point here. What's interesting is many of these facts were known. These were parts of public knowledge that was well known to people who were closely involved, like the actual sources in the event. And yet, legacy media likes to just sit back and, well, we don't know for sure what happened. We've got to wait until we get a press release so that we know what we can tell you. In other words, truth is something that's handed to them by someone in authority. Does that strike you as kind of an odd relationship, or does that strike you as maybe, a revelation of what the relationship between power and the press is today? There's nothing antagonistic or nothing, that would be adversarial in terms of we're keeping an eye on you and making sure that you're dealing with everything out in the open. It's more like we're just waiting for you to tell us what we can say. So the Idaho Tribune reported on this, and the outrage from so-called respectable media was palpable. How dare you do this? How dare you jump to conclusions? You're not a news organization. You'll get everything wrong. And in fact, somebody made up this wonderful meme, which I think pretty accurately describes, the reaction. Shut up! They hated the Idaho Tribune because he told the truth. Now, look, it's not so much a contest of, who gets there first. And even among news organizations, people do like to break the story. They like to be the first, but they also like to be accurate. And that's the question here. Was the information accurate? Well, when the charging reports were released by the police, police were pretty tight-lipped about this too, and you can probably understand why. This is pretty sensitive stuff because it sounds like pedophilic activity was going on. There were complaints that were lodged that potentially were not addressed, or at least were not addressed in a way that someone was actually doing something about it. And eventually, this father snapped. Very tragic on many levels. But I just have to wonder about the press and wonder, is this not a strong reason to question, how the press goes about reporting? And I'm talking the legacy media, and why citizen journalism is actually moving to fill in some of these gaps, in spite of the fact that they don't have the credentials that apparently, will endear you to those in power. Those credentials, by the way, I mean, look, some people may have legitimately accomplished some neat things and won awards along the way, but let's not pretend that by and large, those credentials are simply badges of compliance. I have passed through the system. I have demonstrated enough fealty to the system that the system can trust me to remain, a part of it, or something like that. So the Idaho Tribune reached out and said, okay, now that the probable cause affidavit's been released in the Father's Day massacre in Kellogg, does anybody want to apologize for calling our story just a rumor, misinformation, or fake news? Looking at you. This was from apparently a Spokane area television station personality. Idaho Tribune finally just came out and said, look, just admit that you operate as the PR arm of the government and everyone will leave you alone. All you have to do is stop pretending that what you guys do at the big newspapers and TV stations is journalism. It's not. You repackage and rewrite press releases. Now, that's pretty damning. I mean, those are fighting words to people who pride themselves on, but we're the professionals here. And so the question was brought up, well, what if they got something wrong? What if they reported something that was in error? Now, you got to understand, people and organizations like the Idaho Tribune, it is absolutely within their interest to report things as accurately as possible. Why? Well, it comes down to a matter of credibility. This is something I've observed in my own career, and I'm talking, over 30 plus years of broadcast, and credibility is something that takes a very long time to establish. When you have it, you have it. And people may disagree, but they'll still say, well, I may disagree with you, but I know that you're at least telling me as straight as you understand it. You're speaking the truth as best you understand it, not trying to deceive me. On the other hand, if you in some way violate that trust in your credibility, it's gone. And it will go away a lot faster than it can be, built up. It really takes time to build that relationship of trust. So it's in their interest to be accurate. But let's just suppose, hypothetically, what if they had got something wrong, which in this case they didn't? Well, in the unfortunate event that we get a fact wrong in an article, the Tribune says we just would issue a correction, just like any other news outlet. Here's the difference, though. Most of the legacy news outlets, they don't want to issue a correction. They don't even want to admit that they're wrong. They just pretend that nothing happened and move on. They'll double down. The problem is not with you. The problem is not with the facts. It's not with us. It's, we're moving on to something else. That's hubris, by the way. That's that sense of infallibility and self-importance that we cannot be questioned because we cannot be wrong. Don't you know who I am? It's kind of the catchphrase of such people. So kudos to Idaho Tribune for being out ahead, digging in on this story. In fact, Brian Allman actually had some high words of praise for them, saying, compare and contrast the journalism of the Spokesman Review with the Idaho Tribune. Now, the former, the Spokesman Review, they're a respectable outlet, but their story on the Kellogg shooting was light on details, heavy on folks in shock at the tragedy, whereas the Tribune actually dug into the story and got facts to its readers. Now, again, it's not a matter of it's a race. We've got to see who's in there first. But that cozy relationship with authority, at the very least, should have you questioning seriously whether or not those journalists, maybe I should put those in air quotes, the journalists are telling you the whole truth. Or if they're waiting for someone in authority to hand them the press release so they know this is what's safe to report. This is what we want you to report. Now, why would I bring that up? Because it's exactly what happened during all of the COVID hysteria. How many times did the press play the role of, well, we support what the people in authority are saying. We support what the science is saying. And they were wrong. They still won't admit it. They still double down. They'll still call you a vaccine denier if you question any of it or whatever. They don't want to admit they could be wrong. And that's why you should really think twice about giving them your trust. All right, let's move on to another story. Ah, yes, KTVB. Thank you for telling us that Idaho Democrats say the state has the worst abortion laws in the country following a White House visit. So this was actually a couple of legislators from here in Idaho went to Washington, D.C. to compare notes with other states' legislators and to come back and tell us that we have the worst abortion laws in the country. Let's dig into this story a little bit. Idaho House Minority Leader Representative Ilana Rubel and Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow of Boise returned to the Gem State from Washington, D.C. after meeting with the Biden administration and fellow Democrats from Republican-controlled states. In the meeting, which included 47 other state lawmakers, they compared and contrasted state abortion laws. Idaho is in fact the worst, Rubel said. People are not imagining it. Many of the laws that get run through Idaho have already been run through Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Florida, Missouri, you name it. So it makes a lot of sense for all of us. We're facing similar challenges to get together and see how it's playing out and see if anybody has any great ideas on how to battle back. Now, she's talking about specifically on the issue of abortion. I know there's still these two Democratic leaders are still smarting, as are some people, over the idea that it's the states who ultimately should be making those kind of governance decisions. 50 little laboratories of democracy. Some states are going to be okay with it, just like some states are okay with legal weed, and some states aren't. But they want a one-size-fits-all approach. This is why they took it so hard when Roe v. Wade was overturned last year. The article goes on to say the United States Supreme Court overturned nearly 50 years of federally protected access to abortion through the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health decision, June 24th, 2022. That returned the authority to regulate abortion back to the states. Actually, it acknowledged that it was the state's authority to begin with, not the federal government's. Idaho is one of 14 states now that ban most abortions. However, the laws do hold up legally. I got to give credit, KTVB, thanks for admitting that. The Idaho Supreme Court upheld the state's near total abortion ban in January of this year. The law does provide exceptions for an abortion, including a rape, granted the victim provides a police report or incest or to prevent the death of the pregnant woman. All of which I think reasonable people would agree these are probably the kinds of exceptions that should be allowed by law. In summary, the highest court in the state expressed if the people of Idaho are dissatisfied with these new laws, they can elect new legislators. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the push for open primaries in Idaho, because that's exactly the route that some people are trying to take. We got to muddy up the election process to the point where we can get people in there who can be counted on to stand for left-wing policies and not to stand for, the rights of the innocent to live. But anyway, it dawned on us, said Wintrow, that we actually in Idaho are the worst of the states across the country as far as limitations and just really restrictive laws. We have total abortion bans where some folks have at least up to 12 weeks. We know that these policies being passed are wildly unpopular all over the country, and they'll have consequences. Well, popularity is not necessarily the best measure of whether something is right or wrong. And I say that from the standpoint of, I think a lot of people would probably favor, an amendment banning the burning of the U.S. flag. It would be wildly popular, at least among patriotic Americans. It would still be wrong. And I believe it would be an infringement of free speech, especially if that flag is a privately owned piece of property. Anyway. I like, again, Brian Allman's take on this, where Idaho has the worst abortion laws in the country. He says, no, you mean the best. Baby murder will remain illegal in the Gem State because we actually have laws that reflect what the citizens of this state, or at least a majority of the citizens of this state, believe is important, and that is that innocent life is worth preserving. Now, if a person doesn't like that, if that is intolerable, they have the option of going to another state. Actually, there's probably several right nearby, wink, wink, looking over towards you, Oregon, to where abortion on demand is not only available, but celebrated, along with a lot of other stuff that really doesn't pass muster in Idaho. And yet you wonder, why are so many people flocking to Idaho? Why do people want to come to the Gem State? It's not because, they have the strictest laws to tell me what I can and cannot do. It's because common sense is still fairly common here. In spite of the massive influx of people over the last couple of years, people come here because this is an island of freedom of sorts. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than some of the coastal states and some of the bigger metropolitan areas that really have just leaned into left-wing policies wholeheartedly. By the way, speaking of leaning into left-wing policies, check this one out. The Idaho Statesman is complaining by not allowing the discussion of gender and orientation topics within schools, you're no longer creating a safe environment for kids. This is apparently what some Nampa resident said. And this quickly becomes a life and death issue for some. Now, the headline here is Idaho schools restrict speech about gender identity and sexual orientation in the classroom. I don't even know why this is a headline, in that if this was such an imperative, why wasn't it ever something that was tackled before? Why wasn't it a matter of, we should have been debating this back during, Brown v. Board of Education? Why aren't we talking more about this? Again, I would say it's because common sense was actually more common in those days. And there were things that were understood need to be kept private. Some things you just didn't speak about. I mean, look, like it or not, there was a time when sodomy was referred to as the crime that dare not speak its name, because polite people didn't talk about it. Now we not only talk about it, we celebrate it all month long, and it's mandatory. You will bend the knee and you will celebrate, or you're going to be labeled as some kind of a bigot. Why is it so important to bring this into the classroom? Well, because these kids need to know. Again, the article here talking about, or at least the headline, well, it's a safe environment for kids. Really? It's a life and death issue for kids. Okay, I actually prefer the approach that someone had asked here, and that is, well, what about this? Why can't this be discussed in the home? And of course, you know what the predictable answer is. Well, some parents are themselves sex abusers. They're not going to talk about this. Okay, granted, there are some parents out there who are abusive, and some people, in fact, may be sex abusers. Are we implying that that's the norm? That's the way it is everywhere, and that's why schools are the only hope to give kids, light and truth on such matters? Baloney. Most homes, imperfect as they may be, are not havens for sexual predators. They're not. And we have services that exist, and we have laws that exist to address those problems as they become known. But parents, isn't it interesting? That push for, we have to have a safe environment in which these things can be taught. You know why they call it a safe environment? Because it's out of the eyes and ears of parents who, if they understood that this is what's being indoctrinated into your child's mind, would absolutely put a stop to it. They would drop what they were doing, drive to the school, pick their kid up, and take him out that day. So when they talk about a safe environment, they're not talking about to protect them from hate or to protect them from violence. I know that's the excuse that's given, but it's to protect them from oversight on the part of parents who otherwise would pull the plug and say, oh, no, you are not going to teach my kid that everything that came before us was wrong and evil and has to be rejected. And by the way, my kid, depending on his skin color, should probably hate himself. I'm actually going to give you some examples of some of the things that we're up against that have become accepted as normal in society, and yet we're just expected to go along with it. This is from an article from AmericanThinker.com. We are expected, and by the way, the press really reinforces the idea that this is totally normal and everything is fine when we have ballot counting machines that can't count ballots, when we have judges who refuse to judge, when we have anti-American American presidents, prosecutors who don't prosecute, unless, of course, you're from the wrong political persuasion, peaceful protests labeled as domestic terrorism, and domestic terrorists labeled as peaceful protesters. How about representatives that don't represent? Corporations that don't seek profit, but instead seek to impose some type of ideology. By the way, a lot of them are taking it in the shorts right now. I can't say that there's not a little bit of satisfaction in watching them crash and burn. How about banks that don't protect their depositors' money? News reporters that don't report the news? Well, until somebody in authority hands them a press release and says, here, you can talk about this. How about environmentalist energy policies that waste energy and harm the environment? Scientists who don't use the scientific method. I think we have a recent vaccine researcher who's been making a lot of headlines about this. Well, I called you a duty head, and therefore I have no corresponding responsibility to debate you. How about teachers who don't teach, advocating graphic books on sex for children too young to understand sex, in a safe environment? where parents aren't about. Psychologists and physicians encouraging dysphoria insanity in vulnerable children while trying to keep parents clueless. Men playing women's sports and assaulting girls in their locker rooms. Doctors who don't heal. Promoting vaccines that kill. Groups demanding reparations from people whose ancestors mistreated their ancestors. Free speech that isn't free. Now, you can disagree with some or you can disagree with all of them. But the fact of the matter is, much of legacy media exists for the purpose of keeping people on target or at least on narrative to where, they don't question those things too much. And some of them, Brian Holmes particularly, I'm looking your direction, exist for the purpose of trying to find some slender thread that they can grasp onto to provide some reason to believe that these things are good and normal or they're not happening. But if they are, they're supposed to be happening. Make up your mind, dude. I mean, it's either happening or it's not. And I think most people with common sense can recognize those are not in the best interest of the public. Speaking of not in the best interest of the public, let's talk about, if you don't like it, you can just change your legislators. Well, believe me, there are people who are working very hard to make that happen. Clark Corbin reports in IdahoCapitalSun.com, the Idaho open primary supporters are pressing on with their ballot initiative despite the AG's critique. Now, the Attorney General, Raul Labrador, said, hey, we got a problem with this. This is addressing more than one issue. Citizens' initiatives are supposed to address a single issue. They don't care. This is about power. And the sooner we recognize that, the better. The Idaho AG's office has until the end of June to provide ballot titles for the open primary initiative. So digging into the article a little bit, the supporters of a proposed ballot initiative designed to eliminate Idaho's closed party primary elections and create a new type of general election are moving forward despite a negative legal review by Attorney General Raul Labrador's office. If it qualifies for the November 2024 ballot and then is approved by a majority of Idaho voters, the initiative would do two things. First, it would replace Idaho's closed primary elections with open primary elections that any voter could participate in, regardless of party affiliation. The new primary election would also be open to propaganda candidates, political candidates, regardless of party affiliation. All candidates would run against each other in the primary election, and the four candidates who receive the most votes would advance to the general election. This is a great way to have a California-type outcome. If you remember when Arnold Schwarzenegger ran for governor a few years ago, you had porn star Mary Carey running for office, and I mean, there must have been 20 different candidates. You water down the field, and then it allows better manipulation of, but this one has more money, or this one has better advertising, or better backing, as opposed to who actually does the public want. Try to spread those votes out as far as you can so that we can get our preferred candidate in the spotlight. Far cry from the caucus system. Now, there's also the matter of this initiative would change Idaho's general elections by creating an instant runoff, which we also know as ranked choice voting system. Under the instant runoff, voters would vote for their first candidate of choice and be able to rank the other three candidates in their order of preference. And if no candidate wins a majority of the votes initially, an automatic process of elimination would begin based on the ranked choices voters marked on their original ballots. The last place candidate is eliminated. Their votes are transferred to the second choice candidate on each of those ballots until one candidate emerges as the winner by claiming a majority of the original and transferred votes. That sound a little bit complicated? I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's complicated enough that a person casting their vote isn't just straightforwardly, no, I support this person, I don't support that person, or I support this initiative. Isn't that strange? Now, the Idahoans for Open Primary Supporters Coalition is moving forward after Labrador's office issued a May 31st certificate of review of the Open Primary Initiative that raised concerns about possible conflicts with the Idaho Constitution, as well as legal concerns. Now, in that review, Labrador's office said the initiative violates a state law that says an initiative shall embrace only one subject and matters properly connected with it. Now, I believe that the problem here is, as the AG's review states, there are two distinct subjects in this, and that's in violation of Idaho Code Section 34-1901A. Number one, the so-called open primary that eliminates party primaries. Number two, the institution of ranked choice voting for the general election. These matters are separate subjects. Neither one depends on the other. Now, former Attorney General Jim Jones, who has kind of a thing for Raul Labrador. I don't know why, but it's a really unhealthy, kind of creepy interest in him. Came forward saying, no, they're both about elections, and that's all that matters. And Jim predictably wants to see things muddied in terms of the way that our elections are conducted. And I think he sees this because what he calls extremists, in other words, principled representatives, are finding their way into office. It's not because they've had to deceive the people and run as one thing and then, do something totally different when they get into office. They run as people who understand what limited government is about, who understand what fiscal responsibility is about, and that government is not just, a giant piggy bank that makes everybody's dreams come true, but something that has to be very accountable, very transparent in its use of taxpayer money, and also very clear about staying within the limits of its legitimate power. That's a threat to power seekers and opportunists who want to, do whatever they want to do. And one of the greatest things that these power seekers and opportunists ever do is try to convince us, hey, this is your idea, which is what they're trying to do with this ranked choice voting and these open primaries. It's the same kind of approach that was taken in passing the 17th Amendment, which did away with which did away actually with the appointment of senators to the federal, Senate by state legislatures. They were either elected or they were appointed by the state legislators, but their accountability was to the states that sent them to represent them in the United States Senate. When the 17th Amendment was enacted, it was done, well, hey, don't the people deserve a voice? Sure they do. They have a voice and they deserve to be heard just like anybody else. And so it was sold as, by making it a direct vote of the public. Look at that. The people have a voice. But what happened was those senators, now that they were elected by the popular vote of the people, their loyalty shifted from the states they were supposed to represent to simply the federal government. It's never been the same since. It's been over 100 years, and things have just gotten worse in that time. We can't allow something like that to happen with our primaries and with the way that candidates are chosen for the ballot by these political parties. They're private organizations. Their job is to get people elected. We don't need the state interfering and allowing other people to come in and interfere. Well, I'm going to change my my affiliation, wink, wink, just enough to muddy the waters here. Look, it's not a perfect system. And frankly, I'll tell you right up front, I don't believe that voting fixes a whole lot of things. Voting is what helped create the system that right now is plundering us at so many levels and, trying to force feed garbage to our children's minds. I'm not sure that I have a lot of confidence that voting is going to fix it. However, having said that, I do see some people who I believe are holding the line. And you can tell which ones they are. They're the ones who are described as extremists or far right, or otherwise they are pariahs in the eyes of the legacy media lapdogs. I don't think it ever occurs to those lapdogs that these representatives and sometimes these candidates would probably be much more concerned if they had your approval, if you agreed with them. So you have choices. But let's never forget, truth is not something that's handed to you by somebody in authority. If it's important enough that you need to know it, you need to be willing to dig it out and vet it for yourself. That's the only way to really know what you're standing for and to know what is true and what isn't. And thank goodness for citizen journalists like those with the Idaho Tribune for being willing to step up and fill that gap that has been left curiously open by members of the legacy media. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.